The moonlight spilled through the collapsed roof of the adobe ruin, casting a silver glow on the scene of a small boy's impossible discovery. 12-year-old Wyatt Cole Tucker knelt in the dirt, his hands, raw and blistered from hours of digging, resting on the cold iron of an open chest. Inside, 230 raw turquoise stones, each the size of a hen's egg, absorbed the lunar light and pulsed with a soft blue-green fire. He lifted one, its weight a solid, undeniable promise in his palm. It was heavier than any rock he had ever held, heavy with a future he hadn't dared to imagine just that morning. And then the tears came. Not the silent, choked-back sobs he'd swallowed when his parents died, but a different kind of weeping entirely. A staggering, shuddering release that was not born of sorrow, but of a hope so vast and terrifying it threatened to break his small frame. In the heart of a house called La Casa del Diablo, a forgotten boy was crying because, for the first time in 3 years, he believed he might actually live. This is a story about how the deepest darkness can hide the brightest treasure, and how a single act of forgotten kindness can echo through generations. If you believe that stories of survival and hope deserve to be heard, let us know where you're listening from in the comments below. Your support in liking this story and subscribing to the channel ensures that narratives like Wyatt's can find the audience they deserve. And I promise you, this is a journey you will want to see through to the very end. It's a testament to the fact that sometimes the things the world throws away are the only things worth saving, and the path to freedom is often buried right beneath your feet, waiting for someone desperate enough to start digging. But to understand why a fortune found in a cursed house represented the only possible path to survival, for a boy so utterly alone in the world, it is necessary to go back. We must travel back 3 years, to a time before the turquoise, before the deed to a pile of rubble, before the $3 that changed everything. We must return to the precise moment when Wyatt Cole Tucker, orphaned and adrift in the Sonoran Desert, ceased to be a child and became the property of the one man who was supposed to represent the law. His story does not begin with the discovery of a treasure, but with the cold reality of being owned by the man who wore the town's silver star. Wyatt Cole Tucker was 9 years old when he first laid eyes on Sheriff Horace Dalton. He was a scrawny, sunburnt child, delivered to the dusty edge of Tucson by a freight trader who had found him wandering alone in the Sonoran Desert, his throat too raw to even whisper his own name. The trader, a man with a kind but weary face, had explained the tragedy in hushed tones. A blacksmith father crushed by a spooked mule, a mother lost to the unforgiving heat while searching for water. Sheriff Dalton stood on the porch of his office, the silver star on his chest catching the blinding afternoon sun, making it impossible for Wyatt to see the man's eyes. He offered a glass of water and a solemn nod, presenting himself as a savior, a pillar of order in a chaotic world. To the exhausted boy who had seen nothing but death and dust for days, the sheriff's shadow felt, for a fleeting moment, like the promise of shade. That promise, however, was a mirage. Within an hour, the terms of his new existence were made brutally clear. Dalton sat him down, not in a home, but in his sparse office, the smell of stale cigar smoke and leather hanging heavy in the air. He explained that the town had no orphanage, and that taking in a stray boy was a significant expense. Wyatt, he declared, would have to earn his keep. He would work off the debt of his own rescue, a debt whose sum was never named and whose terms were never defined. It was a contract signed with a child's silence and sealed by his complete and utter dependence. The man who wore the town's badge of law was not adopting a ward. He was acquiring an asset, a piece of property with a strong back, and no one in the world to ask where he had gone. His world shrank to the confines of Dalton's sprawling, neglected ranch on the outskirts of town. It was a place of perpetual dust and labor, where the sun beat down without mercy, and the nights offered little relief. He did not sleep in the main house, a place of forbidden quiet and closed doors, but in an empty stall in the stables. His bed was a pile of old hay, his blanket a threadbare horse blanket that smelled perpetually of sweat and animal musk. The sounds of the horses shifting in the darkness became his only lullaby, their soft snorts and the rhythmic crunch of their feed a constant reminder that he was, in their world, just another creature kept for its utility. The cold of the packed earth seeped into his bones each night, a coldness that had nothing to do with the temperature. His days were a blur of unending chores, a litany of tasks designed for a grown man, not a boy of 9, then 10, then 11. He was awake before the first hint of dawn, his small hands breaking the icy surface of the water in the trough to haul buckets to the livestock. He mucked out stalls until his arms ached with a deep burning fire, mended fences under the relentless Arizona sun, and cleared rocks from fields that refused to be tamed. There was no school, no books, no moments of rest. His education was in learning the precise weight of a full water bucket, the sharp sting of a splinter from a fence post, and the geography of pain as it moved through his exhausted body. He ate whatever scraps were left on a tin plate shoved through the stable door, a silent transaction that reinforced his status as something less than human. Sheriff Dalton governed this small kingdom with a quiet, menacing authority. He rarely raised his voice, for he didn't need to. His power was in his presence, in the cold, a praising look he would give Wyatt, as if measuring his worth against the cost of his meager upkeep. Any perceived mistake, a tool left out, a gate not latched securely, a moment of hesitation, was met with the swift, stinging slap of the back of his hand. Wyatt learned to become a ghost, to move silently through his chores, to make himself as small and unnoticeable as possible. Dalton's cruelty was not born of anger, but of a chilling indifference. He was cultivating not a boy but a tool, and a tool required only maintenance and control, ensuring it remained isolated, ignorant, and utterly compliant. He remembered one afternoon with perfect, searing clarity. He had been trying to repair a leather strap on a saddle, his fingers clumsy and numb from the morning's chill. The awl slipped, piercing the fine leather just beside the original seam. Dalton, who had been watching from the doorway without a word, walked over, took the strap from Wyatt's hands, and examined the tiny, misplaced hole. He said nothing. He simply dropped the strap in the dust, and with a calm, deliberate motion struck Wyatt across the face. The blow sent him stumbling backward into the hay. The sheriff turned and walked away, leaving the boy on the ground, the metallic taste of blood in his mouth, his cheeks swelling with a pain that was less about the physical impact and more about the crushing lesson in perfection and consequence. In the suffocating darkness of the stables, Wyatt's only escape was into the dwindling memories of his past. He would close his eyes and try to summon the image of his father's hands, broad and calloused, yet gentle as they showed him how to shape hot iron at the forge. He would strain to hear his mother's voice, singing a soft tune as she mended his clothes by lamplight. These memories were becoming fragile like old photographs left in the sun, their edges fading, their colors washing out. Each passing day on the ranch stole a piece of them, replacing the warmth of his mother's song with the cold silence of Dalton's presence, and the strength of his father's hands with the stinging memory of the sheriff's. He kept a single, secret treasure hidden in a loose board beneath his haybed. A small, smooth riverstone his father had given him years ago. It was a simple gray stone, unremarkable to anyone else, but to Wyatt it was the last tangible piece of his former life. At night he would hold it in his palm, its coolness a comfort against his skin, its weight a tiny anchor to the boy he used to be. It was proof that he was Wyatt Cole Tucker, the son of a blacksmith, not just the sheriff's boy, not just a nameless shadow that slept with the animals. Clutching the stone, he would whisper his own name into the darkness, a small act of defiance against the world that sought to erase him completely. To the people of Tucson, he was largely invisible. They might see a dusty boy working in the sheriff's fields as they rode past, but they saw what they expected to see. A ranch hand, perhaps a distant relative, a part of the landscape. The silver star on Dalton's chest was a shield of legitimacy, deflecting any questions before they could even form. Who would dare to question the town's foremost figure of justice? Wyatt was hidden in plain sight, his servitude masked by the very authority that was supposed to protect the innocent. He was a secret the town kept without even knowing it, a testament to the fact that the darkest evils often wear the most respectable disguises. Yet a flicker of something unbroken remained within him. It was a stubborn, quiet thing that refused to be extinguished. He found it in the flight of a hawk circling high above the ranch, its freedom a sharp, painful thing to witness. He would watch it for as long as he could, imagining what it would feel like to be so high, to see the world not as a cage, but as an open expanse. He began to collect words, sounding them out from discarded pieces of newspaper he found blowing against a fence line, piecing together a language that was forbidden to him. Each word he learned was a secret key, a small weapon against the ignorance Dalton enforced upon him. By the age of 12, Wyatt was a study in contrasts. He was small for his age, his growth stunted by poor nutrition and hard labor, but his body was wiry and tough, corded with the muscle of survival. His hands were the hands of an old man, calloused and scarred, but his eyes held a deep, watchful intelligence that missed nothing. He had learned to read the subtle shifts in Dalton's moods, the tightening of his jaw that signaled impending punishment, the slight narrowing of his eyes that meant danger. He was a boy who had been forced to become a master of observation, his survival depending not on strength, but on his ability to anticipate the movements of his captor. The 3 years on the ranch had compressed time into a flat, unchanging landscape of work and fear. The seasons changed. The sun rose and set, but his reality remained the same. Hope had become a dangerous luxury, a fragile thing that he had learned to pack away like the river stone, kept hidden in the dark. He no longer waited for a rescue that would never come. He no longer dreamed of a different life. His existence had been reduced to the singular, all-consuming task of enduring the present moment, of surviving one day so that he could wake up and survive the next. He was a prisoner who had forgotten the shape of the world outside his cell. He had ceased to be a child in every way that mattered. The capacity for play, for laughter, for trust, all had been systematically beaten out of him, replaced by a quiet, hardened vigilance. He was a vessel of endurance, a silent witness to his own slow erasure. What he did not know as he moved through the monotonous rhythm of his days was that this grim stability was about to be shattered. The foundation of his miserable world was about to crack, and from that crack, a new and more terrifying threat would emerge, forcing the boy who had learned only to endure to finally learn how to fight back. The illusion of permanence, however grim, was shattered on a Tuesday. The evening air was thick and heavy, promising a storm that never came, trapping the day's oppressive heat close to the ground. Wyatt was in the stables, performing the last of his chores, the rhythmic scrape of his shovel against the packed earth, a familiar and miserable sound. He was mucking out the stall closest to the back of the sheriff's office, a place he usually avoided. But tonight, the window was propped open with a book, a rare attempt by Dalton to catch a non-existent breeze. It was through this narrow gap that the voices first reached him, a low murmur that cut through the chirping of the crickets. He recognized Dalton's flat, authoritative tone immediately, but there were 2 other voices, deeper and rougher, their words laced with the thick, rolling accent of the Sonora region to the south. Instinct, honed by 3 years of painful lessons, made Wyatt freeze. He became part of the shadows, his small frame still and silent, the shovel held motionless in his hands. He pressed himself against the rough wood of the stable wall, the splinters digging into his shoulder. The voices from the office grew clearer, and the words began to take on a terrifying shape. They were not discussing cattle or land, they were discussing a commodity. He heard a price named, a sum that felt both impossibly large and sickeningly small. $50 silver. The men who Dalton called brokers were laughing about something, a dry, humorless sound. They spoke of labor, of strong backs and nimble hands, of boys who were too young to complain and had no family to come looking for them. A cold dread, slick and oily, began to seep into Wyatt's stomach. He did not yet understand the full context, but he knew with an animal certainty that the asset being discussed, the property being valued at 50 pieces of silver, was him. He was the only boy on the ranch, the only one with no one to ask questions. The conversation then turned to the destination, and the vague horror coalesced into a specific, tangible nightmare. The men spoke of a copper mine deep in Mexico, a place where the sun was a distant memory, and the air was thick with rock dust and the smell of blasting powder. They described the work in casual, brutal terms, hauling ore from deep shafts, working in near-total darkness, breathing air that coated the lungs and stole the breath from a man's body. It was a place from which few returned, a pit that swallowed boys and spat out nothing. The words painted a picture in Wyatt's mind so vivid it was as if he were already there, feeling the crushing weight of the earth above him, the burn of the dust in his throat, the profound and absolute absence of light. He felt the stale air of the stable become thin, and he had to consciously force himself to draw a breath. Then came the phrase that acted as a judge's sentence, a final, unappealable verdict on his life. One of the brokers, his voice devoid of any emotion, remarked that the mine was hard on the young ones. He stated it as a simple fact, a logistical detail of their business. Boys his age, he said, rarely survived for more than a year in the deep shafts. A year. 365 days. That was the lifespan they were purchasing for $50. The statement hung in the hot, stagnant air, a casual pronouncement of death. It was not a risk. It was an expectation. Wyatt felt the blood drain from his face, a wave of coldness spreading through his limbs that had nothing to do with the evening temperature. He was not being sent to work. He was being sent to die, his end a calculated and accepted part of a financial transaction. The final details were settled with chilling efficiency. Sheriff Dalton, his voice as calm as if he were selling a horse, agreed to the terms. The brokers were traveling on to Phoenix for other business and would return in 1 week to collect their purchase and make the payment. 1 week. 7 days. The number seared itself into Wyatt's mind, each day a tick of a clock counting down to his own extinction. He heard the scrape of chairs on the wooden floor, the sound of glasses being set down, the final handshakes that sealed his fate. The conversation was over. His life had been appraised, sold, and its termination date set, all in the space of less than 10 minutes. The routine of his miserable existence was gone, replaced by a terrifying and absolute deadline. He remained frozen against the stable wall long after the broker's horses had trotted away, long after he heard the heavy tread of Dalton's boots moving from the office to the main house. The world had tilted on its axis. The man who had been his captor for 3 years had just revealed himself as something far worse. He was his executioner. The quiet, simmering cruelty he had endured was merely the prelude to this final, ultimate act of disposal. Dalton was not just getting rid of him, he was profiting from his death. The realization was a physical blow, knocking the air from his lungs more effectively than any slap ever had. The sheriff's indifference was not just a character flaw, it was a murderous, calculated greed. In that moment of stark clarity, another truth became painfully obvious. There was no one to run to, no authority to appeal to. How could he report a crime when the criminal wore the town's only silver star? Walking into Tucson and accusing Sheriff Dalton of selling him into slavery would be seen as the fantasy of a troubled boy, if he was even believed to be anything more than a common ranch hand. The law was not a shield for him, it was the weapon being used against him. The very institution designed to protect the innocent was the one signing his death warrant. He was utterly, completely alone, trapped in a cage where the warden, the judge, and the jury were all the same man. The fear that coursed through him was immense, a tidal wave that threatened to drown him. But beneath it, something else began to form. It was a cold, hard resolve, born of absolute necessity. For 3 long years, his single driving purpose had been to endure, to survive each day by making himself smaller, quieter, more obedient. He now understood that the strategy of endurance was a path leading directly to a shallow grave in a foreign country. To continue to endure was to accept his fate. The only chance he had, the only possible way to live beyond the next 7 days, was to do the one thing he had never dared to contemplate. He had to run, he had to escape. The boy who had learned only to withstand punishment must now learn to disappear. The world had been reduced to the sound of his own heart, a frantic, panicked drumbeat against the inside of his ribs. Crouched in the shadows of the stable, Wyatt felt the words he had overheard not as a memory, but as a physical brand seared into his consciousness. 1 week, $50 silver, a copper mine in Mexico, a year to live. The finality of it was absolute, a wall of black stone that had just risen at the end of his path. For 3 years, he had operated on a single desperate principle: endure. He had endured the hunger, the cold, the casual cruelty, and the soul-crushing loneliness because he believed that survival itself was a form of victory. But the conversation from the sheriff's office had stripped that belief bare. Endurance was no longer a strategy, it was a death sentence, a slow walk to a predetermined grave. A new, terrifying clarity pierced through the fog of his fear. He could not stay. He could not wait. The choice was not between servitude and freedom, but between a certain suffocating death in the earth and a slim, desperate chance at life under the open sky. The decision was not made with logic or careful consideration. It was an instinctual recoil from the abyss, a primal scream in the silence of his soul that roared a single word: run. That first night, sleep was an impossibility. He lay in his bed of hay, the familiar scent of dust and animal sweat now feeling like the smell of a tomb. The fear was a living thing, coiling in his stomach and constricting his throat, making each breath a ragged, conscious effort. He clutched the small river stone his father had given him, its smooth, cool surface the only solid thing in a world that had dissolved into terror. He squeezed it until his knuckles were white, trying to draw some forgotten strength from its inanimate weight. He forced his mind to work, to push past the paralyzing images of the dark mine shafts. For the first time, he began to actively catalogue the details of his prison. He thought about Sheriff Dalton's habits, the predictable rhythm of his days, the small moments of arrogance and inattention that he had observed passively for years. He had always seen them as features of his landscape of suffering, but now in the desperate calculus of escape, he began to see them as something else entirely. They were potential flaws in the cage, tiny cracks through which he might be able to slip. The next 2 days were an exercise in excruciating tension, a performance of normalcy that strained every nerve in his body. He went about his chores with his head down, his movements deliberate and slow, terrified that a single misplaced glance or a moment of hesitation would betray the frantic planning happening behind his eyes. He became a spy in his own life, his senses sharpened to a razor's edge. He confirmed what he already knew. Dalton was a man of rigid routine. He left the ranch every evening for the town saloon, always at the same time, the faint scent of whiskey on his breath when he returned hours later. Wyatt paid special attention to the office, noting how the sheriff would often leave the door unlocked, confident that no one in the world would dare to cross him. He watched Dalton's hands, the way he would carelessly toss a few coins from his pocket into a small metal box he kept in the top drawer of his desk. Each observation was a piece of a puzzle, a fragment of a plan so dangerous that thinking about it made his hands tremble. He knew that simply running into the desert was another form of suicide. He had seen what the Sonoran sun could do to a person. It had taken his mother. He needed a destination, a place to go where he could disappear, and he needed resources, however meager, to get there. His mind, starved for any scrap of hope, drifted to the fragments of town gossip he'd overheard on rare trips to the general store with Dalton. He remembered the men talking about the annual auction of abandoned properties, a civic event that provided a bit of local entertainment. They spoke of worthless claims and forgotten homesteads, but one property was always mentioned with a particular kind of derisive laughter: the old Hawkins place. It was a collapsed adobe ruin on a hill just outside of town, a place the locals called La Casa del Diablo, rumored to be haunted by the ghost of a prospector who had lost his mind. A place no one wanted, a place no one would ever think to look for a runaway boy. The thought of the haunted house took root in his mind, growing from a desperate idea into a tangible goal. A cursed place seemed fitting. His life felt cursed, so perhaps he would find a strange sort of sanctuary among its ghosts. But even a cursed house had a price. The auction required a bid, and he had nothing. His 3 years of labor had earned him only scars and calluses. The image of the metal box in Dalton's desk drawer returned to him, no longer just an observation, but a focal point of his entire plan. The thought of stealing, of willfully breaking a rule that would bring the sheriff's full wrath down upon him if he were caught, sent a wave of nausea through him. For a moment the fear was so intense it almost broke his resolve. He weighed the stinging slap of Dalton's hand against the crushing darkness of the mine. He weighed a brutal punishment against a slow, certain death. There was no real choice at all. The risk was terrifying, but the alternative was annihilation. On the second night after his decision, he watched from the darkest corner of the stable as Dalton prepared to leave. He saw the sheriff pause in his office, saw the faint glint of lamplight on the metal box as he dropped a coin inside. Then, precisely at 9 o'clock, the main house door closed, and the sound of Dalton's boots faded down the long dirt track toward town. The silence that descended upon the ranch was immense, a heavy blanket that seemed to amplify the sound of his own breathing. He stayed hidden, forcing himself to wait, to be certain. He mentally rehearsed every step of the path from the stables to the office, picturing the loose board on the porch that always creaked, the way the office door hinge groaned if you opened it too quickly. He imagined the feel of the cold metal coins in his hand. The plan was a fragile, desperate thing, and he knew that a single mistake, a single unexpected noise, would bring it all crashing down. The third night arrived with a suffocating stillness. A pale sliver of moon hung in the sky, offering just enough light to turn the familiar shapes of the ranch into a landscape of menacing shadows. This was the night. He knew he could not wait any longer. Each passing day brought the brokers and the mine closer. He performed his evening chores in a daze, his body moving on autopilot while his mind raced. When he finished, he went to his corner of the stables and pulled the loose board from beneath his haybed. He took out the smooth river stone, its familiar weight a small comfort in his trembling hand. He held it to his cheek, a silent goodbye to his parents and to the boy he had been. He whispered his own name, Wyatt Cole Tucker, into the darkness one last time, a final act of defiance before he attempted to reclaim his life. He was not just property. He was not just a name on a bill of sale. He was the son of a blacksmith, and tonight he would forge his own future or be extinguished trying. The familiar sound of Dalton's departure was the starting pistol for the most terrifying race of his life. He waited, counting to 100 twice, his heart hammering against his ribs with a force that made him feel dizzy. Then he moved. He slipped out of the stables, a small shadow detaching itself from the larger darkness. He moved across the dusty yard with a practiced silence, his bare feet making no sound on the packed earth. Every rustle of a leaf, every distant call of a coyote sounded like an alarm bell. The short distance to the office porch felt like a mile. He reached the door, his hand shaking so violently he could barely grasp the cold brass knob. He took a deep, shuddering breath, the smell of dry dust and night-blooming cactus filling his lungs. This was the point of no return. The moment he turned that knob, the life he had known, however miserable, would be gone forever. He eased the door open, cringing at the low groan of the hinges. Inside, the office was dark, save for the single beam of moonlight that cut across the floor, illuminating a universe of dancing dust motes. The air was thick with the scent of old paper, leather, and Dalton's cheap cigars, a smell Wyatt would forever associate with fear. He crept toward the desk, his eyes locked on the spot where he knew the box was kept. His every sense was screaming, his body convinced that at any moment the door would fly open and Dalton's heavy hand would fall upon his shoulder. He reached the desk and slowly, carefully, slid the top drawer open. The sound of wood scraping against wood was like a gunshot in the profound silence. He saw the box, a simple, dark rectangle in the gloom. His fingers fumbled with the latch, his breath held tight in his chest. With the lid open, he reached inside, his fingers brushing against the cold, varied shapes of the coins. He did not grab a handful. He did not let greed or panic take over. His plan was precise, born of a desperate kind of honor. He had worked for 3 years, 1,095 days of unpaid, back-breaking labor. He methodically felt for the largest coins, the silver dollars, and picked out 3. One for each year of his stolen life. It was not theft, it was the claiming of the only wages he would ever see. He closed the drawer as silently as he had opened it. The 3 coins a heavy, solid weight in his palm. They were more than money. They were his declaration of independence, the price of his own soul, which he had just bought back from the man who had tried to sell it. Clutching the coins, he slipped back out into the night, a ghost leaving his own grave behind. With the 3 silver dollars clutched in his fist, their milled edges digging into his palm, Wyatt slipped from the sheriff's office and melted back into the shadows. The weight of the coins felt immense, heavier than any rock, heavier than the burden of his entire stolen childhood. Each one was a year of his life, a year of labor and fear, now condensed into a cold, metallic promise of a future he had to survive long enough to claim. He did not run. Not yet. The first part of the escape was a lesson in slowness, in becoming a part of the night itself. He moved with a practiced economy of motion, learned from years of avoiding Dalton's attention. His bare feet finding the softest patches of dirt, his breath held tight in his chest. The familiar landscape of the ranch was now an alien territory, a minefield of potential sounds where a snapping twig or a dislodged stone could mean the end of everything. The air, thick with the scent of dust and creosote, felt charged with a suffocating tension. His first true obstacle was the perimeter fence, a line of taut wire that separated Dalton's property from the open desert. It was a barrier designed to keep cattle in, but tonight it felt like a prison wall. He reached the fence line at the far end of the property, the part least visible from the main house. The wire was cold and unyielding beneath his fingers. He had mended this very section a dozen times, but he had never tried to cross it. He found a spot where a post was slightly looser in the ground and began to climb, his small wiry frame straining with the effort. His foot slipped on the lowest strand of wire, and for a heart-stopping second, he dangled, his weight causing the entire section to groan in protest. The sound was a low metallic twang that seemed to echo for miles in the profound silence of the desert night. A single disastrous note played in an orchestra of quiet. He froze, his body pressed against the wooden post, every muscle locked in terror. He waited for the sound of a door opening, for the sharp, angry bark of Dalton's voice cutting through the darkness. He expected to feel the heavy hand on his shoulder, the brutal finality of being caught. But there was only the chirping of crickets and the whisper of the wind through the sagebrush. The silence that followed was somehow more terrifying than the noise he had made, a void filled with his own frantic heartbeat. The fear was a physical thing, a cold liquid that flooded his veins, threatening to paralyze him, to root him to that spot until the sun rose and exposed him. He closed his eyes, the image of the copper mine flashing behind his eyelids, the darkness, the dust, the suffocating end of a short life. That image was the only thing powerful enough to break the spell. As if summoned by his mistake, a dog began to bark from a neighboring ranch, a frantic, insistent sound that carried easily on the night air. The sound was an alarm bell, a public announcement of a disturbance. Wyatt scrambled the rest of the way over the fence, ignoring the sharp bite of the wire as it snagged his worn shirt. He landed clumsily on the other side, his ankle twisting beneath him, sending a sharp spike of pain up his leg. He bit down on his lip to keep from crying out, the coppery taste of blood filling his mouth. He couldn't stay there. The barking continued, a relentless beacon that could draw unwanted attention. He pushed himself to his feet, ignoring the throbbing in his ankle, and forced his body into a stumbling run, plunging into the relative cover of the desert scrubland that stretched out before him. He was now in the wild, a landscape that was both familiar and hostile. He ran without a clear path, his only guide the faint silvery light of the partial moon. Mesquite branches, armed with thorns like needles, tore at his skin and clothes, leaving a trail of small, stinging cuts. The ground was uneven, littered with loose rocks that threatened to send him sprawling with every step. He focused on the act of moving, on placing one foot in front of the other, on drawing air into his burning lungs. The pain in his ankle was a dull, constant fire, but the fear was a far greater motivator. He imagined Dalton returning early, discovering the missing coins, and coming after him. The thought of the sheriff on horseback, a relentless hunter in the darkness, was enough to keep his legs pumping despite the exhaustion that was already beginning to set in. After what felt like an eternity, he had to stop. His lungs were on fire and his vision was starting to swim with black spots. He collapsed behind a large granite boulder, his body trembling uncontrollably. He pressed his back against the cool, rough stone, gasping for air, trying to silence the ragged sounds of his own breathing. In the darkness, the world seemed to shift and lose its shape. Every shadow looked like a man. Every rustle of a desert creature sounded like footsteps. For a terrifying moment he was completely disoriented. He had no idea which way he had come or which way he was supposed to go. The sheer vastness of the desert, which had promised freedom just moments before, now felt like a crushing, indifferent cage. Panic began to rise in his throat, a suffocating wave of despair that whispered he would die out here lost and alone. Just as the panic threatened to consume him, A small moment of grace arrived. A bank of thin clouds that had been obscuring the moon drifted away, and the desert floor was suddenly bathed in a brighter, clearer light. He looked up, his eyes frantically searching for a landmark, anything familiar, and then he saw it, a tall lone saguaro cactus, its two arms raised to the sky in a distinctive shape. He had seen it 100 times while working in Dalton's farthest field. It marked the direction of the old irrigation ditch that ran parallel to the main road into Tucson. It was his compass. The sight of it was enough to steady his racing heart, a small anchor of certainty in a sea of chaos. He knew his destination now. He had a line to follow. The despair receded, replaced by a fragile, renewed sense of purpose. He pushed himself away from the rock and started moving again, this time with more direction. He kept the saguaro in his sights, his pace no longer a frantic sprint but a determined, limping jog. The physical toll of the escape was making itself known. His bare feet were a mess of cuts and bruises from the sharp rocks, and every step sent a jolt of pain through his injured ankle. He was thirsty, his mouth as dry as the dust he was kicking up with his feet. But he didn't stop. He thought of the $50 silver, the price of his life. He thought of the men with the rough accents and their casual discussion of his death. This pain, this exhaustion, it was the price of living past next week. It was a price he was willing to pay, one agonizing step at a time. The fragile determination in his heart was hardening into something tougher, something more resilient. As he drew closer to the main road, another sound reached him, carried on the wind. It was faint, a low murmur of noise from the direction of Tucson. He recognized the sound of distant, drunken laughter, punctuated by the tinny notes of a poorly played piano. It was the sound of the saloon, the sound of the place where Sheriff Dalton was, at that very moment, drinking and unaware. The sound should have been a comfort, a confirmation that his captor was occupied. Instead, it sent a fresh jolt of fear through him. It was a reminder of how close he still was, a reminder of the man whose cruelty was the engine of this entire desperate flight. The sound spurred him on, giving him a new burst of adrenaline. He had to put more distance between himself and that sound, between himself and the man who thought he owned him. He finally reached the edge of a deep, dry arroyo, a jagged scar in the earth that he had not anticipated. It was too wide to jump and too steep to navigate quickly. He wasted precious seconds looking for an easier place to cross before realizing there was none. He had to go down. He slid down the loose, gravelly bank, the small stones digging into his hands and knees, trying to break his fall. He landed in a heap at the bottom, the impact jarring his entire body. Scrambling to his feet, he clawed his way up the opposite bank, his fingers digging into the dry earth for purchase, his muscles screaming in protest. It was a brutal, primal climb, and when he finally pulled himself over the top, he lay on the ground for a moment, his body a single throbbing ache covered in a fresh layer of dirt and scratches. From the top of the arroyo, he could see the main road, a pale ribbon of dirt under the moonlight. This was the most dangerous part of his journey. To reach the irrigation ditch, he would have to cross it, exposing himself completely. He scanned the road in both directions. It was empty. Taking a deep breath, he bolted from his cover, his feet pounding on the packed dirt of the road. For those 10 seconds, he felt utterly naked, a tiny moving target in the vast open space. He expected to hear the thunder of hooves, to see the silhouette of a horse and rider appear on the horizon. But nothing came. He was a ghost, unseen and unheard. He reached the other side, his heart feeling as if it would burst through his chest, and dove into the scrub brush that lined the far side of the road. He could smell it before he saw it, the faint, damp, earthy scent of the irrigation ditch. It was his sanctuary, the hiding place he had pinned all his hopes on. He pushed through a final thicket of mesquite, and then he was there at the edge of the ditch. It was deeper than he remembered, a dark, protective trench carved into the land. Without a moment's hesitation, he half climbed, half fell into it, tumbling down the sloped side. He landed on the bottom, the ground cool and slightly damp against his overheated skin. The sudden coolness was a shock, a profound and immediate relief that seemed to extinguish the fire in his feet and lungs. He had made it. He had escaped the ranch. He lay there in the darkness of the ditch, his body screaming with a chorus of new pains, but he felt none of them. All he could feel was the overwhelming, crushing wave of relief. He was hidden. He was safe, at least for now. He slowly uncurled his fist, the one that had been clenched tight for the entire journey. The 3 silver dollar coins were still there, their shapes imprinted on his skin. He pressed them against his cheek, their metallic coolness a comfort, a tangible piece of evidence that what he had just done was real. Lying in the damp earth, alone under the vast Arizona sky, Wyatt Cole Tucker finally allowed himself to take a full, deep breath. He was no longer the sheriff's property. He was just a boy, with $3 to his name and a future that was, for the first time in 3 years, entirely his own to fight for. The day after the auction was a blur of exhaustion and aching muscles, a long, slow journey from the relative safety of the irrigation ditch to the base of the hill where his new property stood. Wyatt arrived as the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in violent shades of orange and purple. From below, La Casa del Diablo looked less like a haunted house and more like a collection of broken teeth jutting from the earth. The adobe walls were crumbling, and the roof had collapsed in the center, leaving a gaping wound open to the sky. Yet, as he stood there, the deed, a flimsy piece of paper clutched in his hand, felt like the heaviest thing in the world. This ruin, this pile of dirt and forgotten timber, was his. It was the first thing in 3 years that belonged to him, a fortress of solitude purchased for the price of his own stolen childhood. The fear of Dalton was still a cold knot in his stomach, but for the first time it was mingled with the fragile, unfamiliar feeling of ownership. He entered through a doorway that had long ago lost its door, stepping from the open desert into the sudden, profound silence of the ruin. The wind, which had been a constant companion on his journey, died away completely, leaving in stillness that was almost absolute. The air inside was different, cooler, and carried the ancient dry scent of baked earth, decaying wood, and the faint, clean smell of rain that had fallen seasons ago. It was not the stale, oppressive air of Dalton's stables, thick with the scent of manure and fear, but something clean and empty. As his eyes adjusted, he saw that the moonlight was already beginning to spill through the hole in the roof, casting a single, perfect column of silver light onto the dirt floor. It felt less like a derelict building and more like a forgotten church, a place where the only thing left to worship was the sky itself. In a corner where 2 of the remaining walls met, creating a small alcove shielded from the elements, Wyatt finally allowed his body to surrender. He slid down the rough adobe wall, the texture like coarse sandpaper against his torn shirt, and sat on the cool, packed earth. The exhaustion he had been holding at bay for 2 days crashed over him in a single, crushing wave. Every muscle screamed, his feet were a raw map of cuts and bruises, and his ankle throbbed with a dull, persistent fire. He pulled his knees to his chest, making himself as small as possible, and for a long time he did not move. He just breathed, in and out. The simple act of drawing air into his lungs, without the fear of immediate discovery, felt like a miracle. He was alone. He was hidden. He was, for this single, precious moment, safe from the man with the silver star. The first week was a testament to the brutal realities of survival. The initial relief of safety gave way to the pressing, primal needs of hunger, thirst, and shelter. The ruin offered protection from the wind, but not from the cold desert nights. He spent his days gathering mesquite branches and using mud from a nearby arroyo to patch a small section of the roof, creating a meager but effective shield against the elements. His greatest fortune came not from the land, but from a chance encounter with a Tohono O'odham elder, a woman with eyes as dark and wise as the night sky, who was gathering medicinal herbs at the base of the hill. Seeing his desperation, she spoke no words of judgment, but simply showed him how to harvest the fruit of the prickly pear cactus without being impaled by its spines. A gift of knowledge that was a gift of life. By the second week, the immediate crisis of survival had passed, but a deeper need began to assert itself. He did not want to simply exist in this place. He wanted to live in it. He needed to transform the ruin from a temporary hiding spot into a home. The first and most fundamental step was to create a proper place to sleep, a space that was not just a random patch of uneven, rock-strewn dirt. He chose a spot in the most protected corner of the structure and resolved to level it, to create a small, flat rectangle of earth where he could lie down and feel for the first time that he had a bed of his own. It was a simple, practical goal, a small act of domesticity in a world that had offered him none, but it felt monumentally important. He found the rusted, discarded head of a shovel half buried near what was once a corral. After fashioning a crude but sturdy handle from a solid mesquite branch, he began his work. The labor was slow and exhausting. The dirt floor, packed down by decades of sun and neglect, was as hard as stone in some places. The rhythmic scrape and thud of the shovel became the only sound in his world, a lonely percussion against the vast silence of the desert. Scrape, lift, dump, scrape, lift, dump. He was not digging with any purpose other than to create a level surface. He was not looking for anything, not expecting anything. His world was reduced to the ache in his shoulders, the sweat dripping into his eyes, and the small, satisfying progress of moving dirt from one place to another. It was in the late afternoon, with the sun slanting through the roof and turning the dust he kicked up into a golden haze, that it happened. The shovel descended for another load of dirt, but instead of the familiar gritty scrape of metal on earth, it made a sound that was utterly alien. It was a hard, hollow thud, a deep, resonant noise that vibrated up the wooden handle and into the bones of his arms. The sound was so unexpected, so completely out of place, that he froze mid-swing, the shovel still buried where it had struck. He stood motionless, his heart suddenly hammering against his ribs. It was not the dull, solid crack of hitting a rock. This was different. This was the sound of metal striking metal, a sound that had no business being 3 feet beneath the floor of a forgotten house. A surge of adrenaline, sharp and electric, erased his fatigue. He dropped the shovel and fell to his knees, his mind racing. With a frantic energy, he began to dig at the spot with his bare hands, the urgency of the unknown overriding any sense of pain. The packed earth was cool and unforgiving, but he clawed at it, his fingers scraping and digging, pulling away handfuls of dirt. A few inches down, his fingertips brushed against something cold, hard and unyielding. It was iron. He could feel the rough, pitted texture of rust under his nails. He frantically widened the hole, his breath coming in ragged gasps, uncovering a straight edge, then a corner. It was a box, a large iron chest, deliberately buried, hidden from the world. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. This was not an accident. This was a secret. He worked for hours, long after the sun had set, and the familiar silver column of moonlight had returned to illuminate his frantic labor. The world outside the ruins ceased to exist. There was only the hole, the dirt, and the growing shape of the dark iron object he was liberating from the earth. Finally, after digging a pit nearly as deep as he was tall, the entire chest was exposed. It was massive, bound with thick iron straps, its surface a testament to its long years underground. A heavy rusted lock held it shut, but the hinges on the opposite side were weakened with age. Using the sharp edge of the shovel head as a lever, he pried at the lid, putting all of his wiry strength into the effort. With a final agonized screech of protesting metal that echoed in the silent ruin, the lid gave way and swung open. The moonlight spilled through the collapsed roof of the adobe ruin, casting a silver glow on the scene of a small boy's impossible discovery. He knelt in the dirt, his hands raw and blistered from hours of digging, resting on the cold iron of the open chest. Inside, 230 raw turquoise stones, each the size of a hen's egg, absorbed the lunar light and pulsed with a soft blue-green fire. He lifted one, its weight a solid, undeniable promise in his palm. It was heavier than any rock he had ever held, heavy with a future he hadn't dared to imagine just that morning. And then the tears came. Not the silent, choked-back sobs he'd swallowed when his parents died, but a different kind of weeping entirely, a staggering, shuddering release that was not born of sorrow, but of a hope so vast and terrifying it threatened to break his small frame. In the heart of a house called La Casa del Diablo, a forgotten boy was crying because, for the first time in 3 years, he believed he might actually live. The initial shock of the discovery, the raw, overwhelming hope brought on by the sight of the glowing stones, eventually subsided, leaving Wyatt in a state of trembling awe. He sat back on his heels, the moonlight turning the dust on his skin to silver, his breathing still ragged from the emotional release. His eyes scanned the contents of the chest again, not just as a fortune, but as an artifact, a piece of a forgotten story. It was then that he saw it, nestled beneath the final layer of turquoise, almost invisible in the deep shadows of the chest. It was a book wrapped in oilcloth to protect it from the dampness of the earth. It was a small leather-bound journal, its cover worn smooth by time and a thoughtful hand. There was no lock, no clasp, just the simple weight of its own history holding it closed. With fingers that still felt clumsy and numb, he lifted it from its resting place. It felt warm, as if it still held the faintest trace of the man who had last touched it. He unwrapped the oilcloth with a reverence he didn't fully understand, the material crinkling softly in the profound silence of the ruin. The leather of the journal was dark and unadorned. He opened it to the first page, his heart beginning to beat with a new kind of rhythm, not of fear or hope, but of intense, focused curiosity. The script inside was not the wild, illegible scrawl of a madman. It was neat, precise and controlled, the letters formed with an engineer's care. The ink was faded but perfectly clear. The first entry was dated 20 years prior, 1872, and at the top of the page, in the same careful hand, was the name of the author, Ezekiel Hawkins, the name of the man who was supposed to have lost his mind in this very house. The story the town told, the one that had allowed Wyatt to buy his freedom for $3, began to unravel with the turning of that first page. Wyatt read by the column of moonlight, the world outside the crumbling adobe walls ceasing to exist. The journal was not a descent into madness, but a meticulous record of discovery. Ezekiel Hawkins was a geologist, a prospector who understood the language of the earth. He wrote of his systematic search in the Dragoon Mountains, of his belief in a unique geological formation that others had overlooked. He described the moment he found the first sign of turquoise, not with frantic excitement, but with a quiet, scientific satisfaction. He detailed the painstaking process of secretly mining the stones, of hauling them back to his small home under the cover of darkness, his words painting a portrait of a man who was cautious, intelligent, and profoundly aware of the danger his discovery represented. He knew that a find of this magnitude would not bring him fame, but a target on his back from men who preferred to take rather than to create. The journal chronicled the weeks and months Hawkins spent securing his treasure. He chose to bury the chest beneath his own floor, not out of paranoia, but out of a calculated strategy. He wrote that he would leave the territory for a time, let any rumors of his small initial finds die down, and then return when it was safe to sell the stones and begin a new life. He was not a man driven by greed. His entries spoke of building a school, of bringing a permanent source of water to the nearby native villages. He was a man with a vision, and the turquoise was simply the means to achieve it. As Wyatt read, he felt a strange and powerful connection to this long-dead man. He was not reading the words of a ghost, he was listening to the voice of a kindred spirit, someone who understood what it meant to be alone with a secret that was both a promise and a threat. The tone of the entries began to shift in the final weeks. The careful scientific observations were replaced by notes of a growing unease. Hawkins wrote of seeing unfamiliar riders on the ridge overlooking his home, of supplies going missing from his small camp. He mentioned the feeling of being watched, a persistent, unnerving sensation that he could not shake. He described the new deputy in Tucson, a young man with a hungry look in his eyes, someone who asked too many questions about his prospecting activities. He named the man, and as Wyatt's eyes fell upon the name, the air was punched from his lungs. The neat, 20-year-old script spelled out the words, Deputy Horace Dalton. It was a name Wyatt knew better than his own, a name he associated with the sting of a leather strap and the cold, dead weight of servitude. The world tilted. The past and the present slammed together with the force of a physical collision. Horace Dalton, the man who had stolen 3 years of his life, the man who had tried to sell him to a death sentence in a Mexican mine, had been here 2 decades ago, circling this same piece of land like a vulture. The quiet cruelty Wyatt had endured was not a new development in the sheriff's character. It was the final withered form of a greed that had been planted and nurtured for a very long time. Dalton's history of evil was written on this very page, a direct line connecting the murder of a hopeful prospector to the enslavement of a lost boy. Wyatt was not just a random victim of the sheriff's cruelty. He was the latest casualty in a war Dalton had been waging against the world for his entire adult life. The final entry was just a few short sentences, the handwriting no longer neat and controlled, but a rushed, desperate scrawl that spoke of imminent danger. It was clear Hawkins knew his time was running out. He must have written it in the final moments before he was confronted, a last testament sealed in a leather book and buried with his life's work. The words burned themselves into Wyatt's mind, a message sent across 20 years of silence directly to him. It read, "Dalton and his friends know. They are coming for it. If I do not return, they are the reason why. I leave this in the hands of Providence. Use this to do good. There is more where this came from." The last sentence was a final, desperate act of faith, a belief that his work would not be for nothing, that his death would not be the end of the story. Wyatt closed the journal, his hands trembling. He finally understood the full, terrible truth. Ezekiel Hawkins had not gone mad. He had been murdered. He had been silenced by a young, ambitious deputy who wanted his treasure, a treasure that Dalton, for all his cruelty and cunning, had never been able to find. The ghost of La Casa del Diablo was not Ezekiel Hawkins. It was the lingering injustice of his death, the town's superstitious laughter, the story of the mad prospector. It was all a lie, likely started and perpetuated by Dalton himself to keep people away, to ensure no one would ever stumble upon the evidence of his first great crime. He had succeeded for 20 years, until a desperate, forgotten boy bought the one piece of land no one else wanted and started digging a place to sleep. A new wave of tears came, but these were different from the ones he had shed before. This was not the staggering release of hope. It was a flood of profound, aching grief for a man he had never met. He wept for Ezekiel Hawkins, for his stolen life and his stolen dream. He wept for the goodness that had been extinguished by a familiar, brutal greed. He felt the weight of the man's final words. Use this to do good, not as a suggestion, but as a sacred inheritance, a charge passed from one victim of Horace Dalton to another. He was no longer just the boy who had found a fortune. He was the keeper of a man's legacy, the instrument of a justice that was 20 years overdue. He looked from the journal in his hands to the pile of glowing turquoise stones. They were no longer just a path to his own survival. They were evidence. They were the motive for a murder. And the journal was the testimony of the victim. In that moment, the fear of Sheriff Dalton, which had been a constant, oppressive weight on his soul for 3 years, began to change. It did not disappear, but it was joined by something else, something cold and hard and clear. It was purpose. The terror of the hunted was being replaced by the resolve of the hunter. He was not just running from Dalton anymore. He was coming for him, armed with the truth, a ghost's last words, and a fortune in blue-green stone. The knowledge settled deep within him, a solid core of certainty in the midst of his chaotic young life. He was not alone in this ruin. He felt the presence of Ezekiel Hawkins not as a haunting, but as a partnership. A man had died here, but his hope had not. It had lain dormant, buried in the earth, waiting for someone to find it. And in a strange, impossible twist of fate, the man who had murdered him was the very same man who had, through his own cruelty, driven Wyatt to this exact spot. Dalton, in his greed, had inadvertently delivered the instrument of his own undoing to the scene of his original crime. The irony was as sharp and clear as the desert stars burning in the sky above. Wyatt carefully rewrapped the journal in its oilcloth and placed it back in the chest on top of the stones. He closed the heavy iron lid, the sound a soft, final thud in the quiet. He was no longer just a boy hiding from a monster. He was a witness. He had a story to tell, a story that would not only save his own life, but would finally give a voice to the man who had been silenced 2 decades ago. The path forward was no longer an escape into the wilderness, a desperate scramble for anonymity. It was a march toward justice, a journey he would not have to make alone. He had the words of a good man to guide him. He felt a profound sense of gratitude that was almost painful in its intensity. He was grateful for the series of desperate chances that had led him here. He was grateful for the town's superstitious fear, for the auctioneer's casual dismissal, for the $3 silver that had felt like a fortune. And most of all, he was grateful to Ezekiel Hawkins, the man who had looked into the future and trusted that someone someday would be worthy of his legacy. Wyatt stood up, his small frame casting a long shadow in the moonlight. He was still a boy, but he no longer felt like one. He was the heir to a promise, and he would not let it be broken. The weight of the world felt different now. The turquoise was not just a means of escape, it was a responsibility. The journal was not just a story, it was a weapon. Every action he took from this moment forward would be guided by the final wish of a murdered man. The fear was still there, a cold snake in his gut, but it was no longer in control. He had found something more powerful than fear, a reason to fight. Standing in the heart of the house the world had called cursed, Wyatt Cole Tucker made a silent vow. He would not just survive. He would see that justice was done. He would use this gift to build the good that Horace Dalton had tried to bury forever. His alliance with the ghost of Ezekiel Hawkins was sealed not with words but with a shared enemy and a common purpose. The ruin was no longer a simple refuge. It had become a sanctuary, a place where the story of the past would become the foundation of the future. The silence was no longer empty. It was filled with the weight of a 20-year-old secret, a secret that Wyatt now carried as his own. He knew the road ahead would be more dangerous than anything he had yet faced, but for the first time, he did not feel like he was walking it by himself. He had a partner in the earth beneath his feet, and a map written in a dead man's hand. The first rays of dawn began to creep over the distant mountains, painting the edges of the sky in pale shades of grey and pink. A new day was beginning, the first day of the rest of his life. He took one last look at the chest, now just a dark shape in the fading moonlight, and then turned to face the growing light. He had a long walk ahead of him, and a story that needed a new ending. The boy who had been sold for $50 silver was about to purchase a justice that was priceless. Wyatt's journey did not lead him back toward the danger of Tucson, but 50 miles east. Across the harsh and beautiful landscape of the open desert, he walked toward Tombstone, following the quiet advice of Grandmother Crow, the Tohono O'odham woman who had shown him how to survive. He carried with him not the turquoise, which he had carefully reburied, but the journal of Ezekiel Hawkins, its weight against his back, a constant reminder of his purpose. In Tombstone, he found the man she had spoken of, a German Jewish jeweler named Isaac Bernstein, a man whose own history had taught him to recognize both the glint of a rare stone and the haunted look in the eyes of a refugee. Isaac saw the truth in Wyatt's story and the integrity in his desperate plea, offering not just his expertise but his protection. With Isaac's guidance, a plan was carefully set in motion. The turquoise stones were discreetly valued, their worth an astonishing $40,000, a sum that could remake a world. Isaac arranged for them to be sold slowly over years to collectors in the East, the money deposited in a San Francisco bank, under a name that would not draw attention. More importantly, he ensured that Ezekiel Hawkins's journal found its way into the hands of a federal judge, a man beyond the reach of Sheriff Dalton's local influence. The journal, with its meticulous details and its final damning entry, was not the testimony of a madman, but the cold, clear evidence of a 20-year-old murder. An investigation was launched, one that quietly and methodically unpeeled the layers of fear and control that Dalton had wrapped around his small corner of the world. The day the federal marshals rode into Tucson, Sheriff Horace Dalton was sitting in his office, the same office where he had negotiated the sale of a boy's life. He was arrested not for the crime of selling a child, but for the older, darker crime that had been the foundation of his career. The trial was swift, with the journal as its centerpiece and the re-emergence of the turquoise as undeniable motive. Dalton was found guilty of the murder of Ezekiel Hawkins. He was hanged in the town square, the silver star he had tarnished with his cruelty pinned to his chest until the very end. His downfall brought a cleansing light to the shadows, and a subsequent investigation freed 12 other children who, like Wyatt, had been living as indentured servants on the ranches of Dalton's associates, their silence bought by the same fear. Isaac Bernstein and his wife Ruth, who were childless, saw in Wyatt not a project or a ward, but a son. They formally adopted him, giving him the one thing the turquoise could not buy: a family. They provided him with a home filled with quiet love, warm meals, and the transformative power of education. For the first time, Wyatt learned to read not from discarded scraps of newspaper, but from books. He learned to trust the gentle touch of a hand on his shoulder. He learned what it felt like to sleep through the night without fear, to wake up to a world that was not a cage, but a landscape of possibility. He never lost the quiet, watchful intensity that his years on the ranch had forged in him, but it was now tempered with a deep and abiding kindness. When he turned 18, Wyatt Cole Tucker, now a young man with his own fortune, returned to the Dragoon Mountains. He used the information in Hawkins's journal, "There is more where this came from," to locate and purchase the original turquoise mine. But he did not operate it as others would have. He built a company founded on the principles Ezekiel Hawkins had dreamed of, providing fair wages and safe conditions for the local Tohono O'odham and Mexican workers who had been exploited for generations. He used the profits not to enrich himself, but to fulfill the prospector's promise, building a permanent well to bring life-giving water to the desert, and a school to ensure that no child would ever again be kept in the darkness of ignorance as he had been. He lived to be 89 years old, a respected and beloved leader in the community he had helped to build. He never left the small adobe house he had purchased for $3. Over the years, he restored it, not into a mansion, but into a simple, beautiful home. The gaping hole in the roof replaced by a sturdy ceiling, the crumbling walls made whole again. It stood not as a reminder of a cursed past, but as a monument to hope. It was a testament to the profound and enduring truth of his life, that a single act of kindness can echo across generations, that a forgotten history can rise from the earth to deliver justice, and that a place the world has thrown away can become the very foundation for a life of unshakable purpose.